Let's get on to the almost past papers. I didn't want to go through these in detail, so 5 or 10 minutes should be fine. So, someone just throw in the chat, please. Is the share screen working? I like to check these things. All right, thank you, Harsh. Lovely stuff. So, okay, I've got three different essays or questions here on the topic. And they're all slightly different, I think. Which one are we going to start with? Let me just move the Zoom bar down. We're not going to start with this one. This one's the trickiest one. Let's move our way upwards. Okay. This one's very nice and easy. So this is the most recent example in the 2021 paper. Blah 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 blah. Again, this is just in every question, so ignore that. What is the actual question? Evaluate the view that an increase in a country's national debt is damaging for its economy. So that's pretty broad. Damaging for its economy. Maybe we can talk about things like growth, employment. It'd be very easy to talk about austerity policies here. Um, and in fact, this essay you can just kind of plug and play the points that we've just been through. It's great in the sense that you won't have to do much independent thinking here. Obviously, reading the extract, writing the points, but I'm pretty sure we could literally just do yes, it is damaging because it might result in austerity. Evaluation, this depends on the growth rate. Austerity may not actually be a preferred solution to national debt. The country might actually use growth policies instead, in which case the austerity policies will not be damaging because they are not used. We could say it depends on the size relative to GDP. Austerity might not need to be used if the size is small relative to GDP, even though it's large overall. And then FDI goes down, investment goes down, debt trap, whatever. Debt trap is unlikely if the debt is reproductive, or debt trap is not as much of a problem if the debt is internal, because investors will understand that internal debt is not as risky as external debt. So again, you can pretty much just any of the 3 points or all of the 3 points I gave, throw in some of the evals. The evaluations are very, very flexible. So this would be quite nice and easy. What I mainly wanted to look at here actually is these figures, because a lot of people ignore the figures when it comes to the essays, but sometimes, not always, they're just so good in terms of the key points. Like I've given you guys the key points, like the key points, key evals for a debt essay. Can anyone spot how this figure 2, for example, relates to the depends on size relative to GDP evaluation? Like you could literally use figure 2 to do all the hard work for you if you made that point as an evaluation here, that it all depends on the size of national debt to GDP. So can anyone use this data? Just eyeballing it, tell me how this relates. It is, in my opinion, on a plate. They're giving you this figure is just giving you the evaluation. Niati says UK is worse than Greece. She might be right, she might be wrong there. Niati, do you mean in terms of, and Mira has said UK is better, so again, you guys might be wrong, you might be right. Only one of you can be right or wrong. But maybe you should clarify, are you talking about total debt or are you talking about debt to GDP? Is it possible that one of them is better on total debt and one of them is better on debt to GDP? Good, Niati is saying it depends on the ratio. So, guys, everyone else, think about this. Well done, Niati and Mira. I think you're on the right lines. Who's got the worse, the higher total debt? It's obviously the UK. Right, so we can see here the national debt of Greece, 391 billion. UK, that's basically two and a bit trillion, right? Dollars, not pounds, but we can see that $2 trillion is obviously a lot more than 391 billion. So the UK's definitely got more total debt. But look at the GDP. The GDP of the UK economy is more than its debt. So it's got $2.2 trillion of debt, but it earns $2.6 trillion of income per year. And where does it get the money to pay back the debt? From this, from the GDP. So the tax revenue that will pay this debt back comes from the GDP. Now, if you look at Greece, Greece's national debt is much, much higher than their GDP. And that's actually crazy. GDP is what the everyone in the country earns in a year, right? So this is basically everyone in Greece earns 245 billion a year. If they took everyone's money for a whole year, they still wouldn't be able to pay off their national debt of 391 billion. So Greece has a far worse ratio of debt to GDP, which is the problem. That's the real problem. The UK having this really high debt, total debt, isn't necessarily an issue. What economists should look at is debt to GDP. And you can calculate that really simply just by doing this number over this number. That's going to give you a ratio, and because it's both in billion as well, I think that's very, very easy. So that's going to give you a ratio, or you could a decimal that you could turn into a percentage very, very easily. So, um, okay. Hopefully that makes sense. And figure one as well, I think, is on a plate. I said one of the main points problems with debt is the high interest rates or debt trap issue. Again, I think figure one just gives this to you on a plate. Can anyone again put that in the chat? How does this figure one data relate to that specific point about debt traps and problems of having very high debt? You have to read the title of the figure carefully, but I think once you do that, it's quite obvious, or at least it will be once you're comfortable with this topic and this point. So figure one, how does this show? How does this relate to the interest rates or debt cycle argument, debt trap? And you should be looking at um, Greece more than the UK here. Maybe nothing, no, nothing jarring about the data in this table. Nothing that stands out. Ultimate pick Niati, as always. Thank you. So Niati has pointed out the obvious that Greece has much higher yields on government bonds. Maybe some of you are a little uncertain what yield means and maybe a little hesitant to answer, but yield basically is the interest rate or reflects the interest rate, highly related to the interest rate on the bond. So we can see Greece having a debt crisis, which is basically what this whole extract is about, is associated with higher interest rate payments on the government bonds. And again, that can create this vicious cycle where because they're having to pay investors 22% on the long-term bonds, whereas a country like the UK is only having to pay investors a tiny 1.7%. Greece is going to find it much harder to pay back this interest rate, and that's going to make its national debt problem worse, which could lead to interest rates to rise. Obviously, from this 2019 data, though, we might suggest that Greece's debt problem didn't turn into a really, really savage, long-lasting national crisis because they have got this interest rate back down, which suggests investors saw them as lower risk in 2019 than in 2012. But that makes sense because 2012 is like the peak of the European debt crisis. So, okay, very, very quickly then, and sorry for overrunning a few minutes today, but we'll just have a quick look at this one. This is the dream. I don't really have much to say about this because it's just as easy as it gets because it doesn't even say like macroeconomic performance or anything like that. Just is it a cause for concern? Is it bad? Basically, a cause for concern is something that is bad. You don't have to be specific. You can just any bad thing about national debt. We talked about loads, whether it's related to austerity or a lack of investment or FDI. This would be the easiest essay. So this was in 2010. If you want to try it, long time ago. Maybe this is overdue a rerun, but yeah, this would be the dream. Just as simple as it gets. So to contrast that, so we've had one sort of extract base where we can see how the data feeds into the points I've given you, and sort of generally the I'm trying to give you guys for essay questions like the main points I expect them to reference in the extract, for example. Um, we've had one very, very simple non-extract based one, and then finally, I just want to talk very briefly about this non-extract section B1 as well, which is quite a lot more difficult. To what extent do we agree that the implementation of a budget deficit reduction program, i.e., austerity, will improve the UK's long-term economic prospects? So I think I think this question could throw a lot of students off because they've potentially focused too much on the topic and don't read the question carefully enough. It's not really the essay we've just been looking at. We've been looking at, is budget deficit a problem? Is national debt a problem? This is a bit more specific, is really saying, is austerity a good idea, or not? Or is a budget deficit reduction program, which is going to involve austerity policies, again, either a combination of or independently increasing taxes and reducing spending, is this going to improve the UK's long-term economic prospects, like growth, employment, blah, blah, blah? So it's a lot more challenging. And again, I just want to point out that it's a bit of a trap in that students might be basically thinking we're being asked if a budget deficit is a good thing or a bad thing. You can apply a lot of the same points, but you've just got to be careful because again, you've got to make sure you are answering the precise question. Um, it's not that difficult if you don't misinterpret it. So, I mean, easy points would be it will not improve the UK's long-term economic prospects because AD will fall. That's pretty much go-to point, and then explain what that means for, say, growth and employment. And then evaluations could be Keynesian LRS. That's a classic for a shift in AD. Depends on other factors in the economy. So ceteris paribus might not hold. Um, Obviously, there are more important factors in AD than government spending and taxation. You could do a point on how a budget deficit reduction program might improve FDI if international lenders and investors think that the program means the deficit will be reduced. So you can adapt the points we talked about, but I think you've just got to be really, really careful about what you're being asked in these kind of questions and not just jump to the assumption that if it says budget deficit or national debt, that you are necessarily being asked, is that a problem? Again, if you think about it, this is really, is a specific policy to reduce national debt a problem? That's what this question is. Is a specific policy to reduce national debt a problem or a good thing, right? It's not actually asking you whether the deficit itself is the problem in this case. It's asking you whether the specific policy to reduce that deficit is a problem. Now, of course, those questions are related, obviously so. So I'm not saying you have one set of points for one and one for the other. There's going to be a lot of overlap, but they are not exactly the same question. And that's very important.